Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
All right, well, let's go ahead and get started here. Welcome, everybody in the room and those of you online. My name is Alex Wade with MSR Outreach, and it's my pleasure to welcome today Arfon Smith. Arfon has had a very interesting career, going from being a research scientist to actually getting into to GitHub where he is now. But prior to that, he was involved in the Zooniverse platform and was one of the leaders in sort of the crowdsourced software space. And now he's turning his attention more fully to how software can be used really within the research community. So it's my pleasure to welcome him here today, and thank you, Arfon.
Thanks. And thanks for having me here today. Also, I need to apologize immediately for the most stupid talk title ever. It seemed brilliant when I wrote it, but it only probably means something to me. The idea being that these are variables that you could substitute, so we'll do that a bit later on. Anyway, so my background is research. I have a PhD in astrophysics. I very quickly realized. What's that?
My son's in astrophysics.
Oh, really? Awesome. All right, good. All right, but it turns out I'm a terrible astronomer. So I then had a year in a group writing software in Bioinformatics Institute, which was fun. And then, yes, as Alex said, was doing stuff with Zooniverse. So I guess all through my career, I've been writing software for research domains. Initially for myself during a PhD, but then later more for to facilitate the research of others. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is sort of, I guess, influenced by those experiences. So yeah, my name's Arfon Smith. You can find me online as Arfon on GitHub and elsewhere on the web. But I work for this company called GitHub, which I think most of you probably know about. But if you don't, it's pretty much the largest source of open source software on the web. And so it's, when I try and explain what GitHub is to people, this is, I sort of got a bunch of versions, and I've just had a meeting with half of you in the room, so you guys are probably the least in need of explaining this, but it's this distributed version control. We'll only spend a couple of slides on it that helps with versioning stuff. This is how I explain GitHub to my mum or to somebody non-technical, because we've all done this, even though track changes exists for some reason. And I realize I'm on Redmond campus now, so I'm going to keep my rhetoric down. Like, track changes has never worked for me beyond about 3 authors. Like, people turn it off or ignore it, or I don't know. Like, you end up doing this, and your version control is your inbox, which obviously sucks. And so actually, and of course, you'll probably be aware that actually we can't solve the problem very well for Word because it's not line-oriented and so not very well versioned in Git as a technology. But this is a mathematics book that was written by about 50 people up on GitHub. It's written 47 contributors with 3,000 commits. This was written by a whole bunch of authors, and they were using this. So it was something line-oriented. They're writing, they're mathematicians, they're writing in tech, right? So they are, in every, this is the equivalent of track changes on GitHub. This is a single commit. We're showing line additions, line removals, line-by-line changes. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that's happening on GitHub. There's the very small. So if you are writing LaTeX, then this is a file that's useful to you when using Git. This is the hidden file that tells Git what to ignore in a project. So LaTeX spews out all these temporary files left, right, and center, and actually you probably don't want to version those as you go. So this is a git ignore file that's actually got a whole bunch of people both forking it, starring it, so people are kind of getting value out of this. And then at the very large scale, this is a 7 million line code base. It's C and Python and all sorts of other things, but it's the production software pipeline for the CMS experiment on the Large Hadron Collider. So this is one of the 2 experiments that detected the Higgs boson. This is a group that are active on GitHub. They collaborate on GitHub. There's about, I forget how many authors there are. I think there's about 300 authors on this project, but they're PhD students in labs, and they are building, the software that produce the data. It's not the science part of the experiment, it's the kind of production, kind of data release part, the bit that manages the instrument. That's all happening on GitHub. So from the very, very small to the very, very big. I also have to sometimes do this when I speak, which is explain what researchers do and why I think GitHub is kind of relevant. And so I have this kind of story that I like to tell, which the tilde version is that astrophysics is technical. People are smart. They are solving hard problems, but their research workflows are brimming with inefficiencies. Like they are wasting vast amount of time. And this is not because astronomers are silly people, but it's because they don't know about technologies that we know about in the open source world. And so astrophysics is, shame about the lighting, but never mind, it's otherwise very nice. Projector, this is a telescope, it's on the top of Mauna Kea. Astrophysics is going to wonderful places, using amazing instruments, seeing the sky like most people don't, and using, this is the last telescope I used, it's the Anglo-Australian telescope in Australia, and so, it's like big science, big hardware, but the technology actually looks like this. So this is the control system for that telescope. So there's, I think, like VAX hardware underneath this somewhere that actually is in the kind of production pipeline for data off the telescope. So, there's both the absolute pinnacle of engineering effort goes into creating these things, and the computation stuff is sometimes behind. And also this is the kind of rarely seen side of astrophysics. This person, his name's Steve Fossey, he's so tired that he's got a post-it note on his face telling him to remind me to remind him to change something about the configuration of the hardware, because it's 3 a.m. and we've been awake for 27 hours and we're jet lagged, and so it's not that glamorous. But the point about what you're doing in data reduction is that you spend time. This is kind of a common pattern in research, that your job as a researcher initially is to kind of remove the effect of the instrument that you're using from the data you've collected. You want to be able to compare data sets from multiple different instruments. And so the detectors that are used in telescopes, typically CCDs, so this is what they look like when you illuminate them, and you can see these are quite big physical devices. They're probably like about this large. They're somewhat larger than the CCD in your phone. But you can see they've got all sorts of weird fringing effects, and this is kind of internal reflections that go on inside the device. And when you zoom in on them and look at them up close, because they're quite expensive devices, but astronomers sometimes buy cheap versions of these things because your telescope's really expensive, so you're cutting costs on the CCD. You get these stuck pixels, these white ones. These are called hot pixels. So these are pixels that are not actually detecting light. They're just stuck reading out 100% all the time. So you can see that these columns, if we scroll down the CCD, there's a hot column that runs top to bottom all the way up and down the CCD. But then if you actually look in further, then you see that there's actually lots of these small pixels all across the device. So there's these pixels in your data set that you want to remove, right? So this is what a researcher does when they first get their data from the telescope. So you open up this viewer and you look at these files, because some of them are really obvious, but some of them are really subtle, like this one. You'll see, like, not only is it not stuck on 100%, but the response function's gone a bit weird on the CCD. So you end up making this thing called a bad pixel mask, and it's plain text, and it looks something like this. It describes x1, x2, y1, y2 positions for all the crappy data. Yes?
Per telescope, like
per detector, yes.
So like you don't have to, if you're new to the telescope, you don't have to go and build it for yourself every time. Like somebody did it like 20 years ago when they first turned.
Wouldn't that be wonderful? Wouldn't that be amazing if that happened? No, I'm about to tell you what actually happens is that everybody does this every time, right? Mm-hmm. So that detector is, I said brimming with inefficiencies. That detector, well, it's an expensive telescope. You probably only get 3 nights of use on it, so it has 2 different groups using it every week, or maybe you get 2 days, 3 observing groups using it every week. It takes about 2 days when you first look at a new detector. If you've never done that task before, so a new PhD student like I was, it takes a couple of days to really get a canonical bad pixel mask. That detector will probably be on the telescope for 15 years, and so there's about 13 years of human effort, ballpark, wasted doing that task, and nobody shares these things. So these are the most shareable
No one was like, hey, you used it Wednesday, how about you give me what you...
Nope.
Really?
Is
Nope.
it like, why?
Nobody thinks to. Like,
There's something meditative about doing the same thing.
but there's this,
over and over
no, but
again.
there's this
It's a
idea as well
calm-
that there's this like rite of passage as well, right? Oh, everyone's got to make a bad pixel mask. And you know, when you've used the telescope again, you probably use your old one, but you have a quick look. The problem is as well is they're not absolutely static, so they evolve, right? People drop, you know, like things into the instrument, or somebody spills coffee or something. You know, they're static like in like the person who used the telescope 2 weeks ago, you could just share. But you probably wouldn't want to share the one from 3 years ago. You probably would want to make a new one. Or you would at least want to version the one, and then we could all iterate and collaborate around it. So if the most extreme use case here, and I'm being deliberately extreme here, but is that it's perfectly feasible that you might spend a decade of human effort writing these things. And I would like to say that this is unusual, but I think this is normal, actually, in research. Like this kind of inefficiency where the things that we produce as researchers, the things that we only think about really ever are the papers at the end. We don't think about the products of our research as we go. So this is kind of a deliberately extreme example, but I think if ever there was a use case for the kind of most human time wasted on a single file, it would be probably bad pixel masks, because they're, you know, years per byte is the unit, I think. Anyway, so how do open source communities kind of deal with problems like this? How do they collaborate around stuff? Well, the first thing I wanted to do, just because I think this is a sort of experienced audience, is I want to just draw a slight difference between open source and open collaborations, because I think there's a subtlety there that matters, especially in academia. And so very broadly and hand-wavy, I'm not a licensing guru nor law trained, but you know, open source is about a right to modify the underlying thing that you have been, you have stumbled across. You know, there's some kind of contract there that you have confidence that you can take what's been published, and you have a right to modify and reuse that work. But you don't actually, with an open source license, there's nothing there saying you can contribute back to that project. That is, there's no right to contribute there. And so this is the kind of difference between, I think, open source and open collaborations, and this is where GitHub and academia, I think, where academia can learn a lot from what happens on GitHub, is that open collaborations are often also open source projects. The product of these communities are, but the idea is that anyone who's competent, if they make a valid contribution, then they might have a reasonable expectation of that contribution going back into the project.
Right. I mean, if Stallman were here, though, he'd be hopping up and down and say, well, the whole intent of copyleft was that, you know, if I forked from you and then did some additions, then I had to contribute it back.
Sure.
And so that the intent was
So I might have
collaboration, but maybe the mechanism wasn't.
So I might have to make it available, but would it go back into the canonical source? So that's kind of what I'm saying. Like, if I stumble across a library that's got an open source license on it, I might do some amazing work, but
It's great for forking, not for merging.
Right. So the maintainers might have no interest in taking contributions back. So
You have to develop a whole community around that.
Right. And so it's this kind of open collaboration that. So I guess I'm talking about today. I want to sort of talk more about how academics or the academic model could work well for, I guess, open collaborations, and also open, as in open source and open science. But so what's different, you know, comparing and contrasting what I just kind of explained in that situation with bad pixel masks? Well, in open source, there's this culture of reuse, right? So there's no shame in picking up the work of somebody else and building upon that. In fact, this is actually core to how the expectations or the norms of the community. But there's something more than that, and there's something that that academics really don't have, is that the environments in which open source software is often built is actually lower friction than academic environments. So, you know, emailing Word documents or sitting in a room together, these are not models that scale when you've got something like 4,000 people working together on a project. And so the piece of GitHub that I think is most interesting, and this is, I guess, my sales pitch, is what happens on pull requests. And I think this is pretty much the only feature that I'm going to talk about today that's about GitHub. And I think a really good example of this, and again, sorry, some of these slides are probably a little bit inappropriate for this audience, but you know, there's this is a project called Homebrew, which is a thing that you put on. It's not inappropriate because of what I'm about to say. You put it on your Mac, and it allows you to get some software dependency on your computer. So if you want MySQL, or you want some kind of C library installed, or some kind of weird esoteric bit of software, then there's this package management thing called Homebrew. But it is an open source project. It's got 3,700 contributors. So how the hell does that work? Well, the way it works is that a whole bunch of people take copies of this by forking on GitHub. So when I click that button on GitHub, if you haven't done it, you basically get asked, well, where do you want to take a copy of this code base? Where do you want to take it to? So I exist as an individual on GitHub. I work for GitHub, so I'm in a few organizations that belong to GitHub, these ones, but I've also interacted with the Mozilla Science Lab, so I'm on some of their projects as well. But I basically take my own copy. We call this forking. You fork the code base, you bring it into your namespace on GitHub. So this is effectively a namespace branch of the code base. And then I just go away and I write my new formula that goes into Homebrew. This is where I go and do my work. And this has happened tens of thousands of times on GitHub. I was going to see if we can see the number of pull requests on Homebrew. But this happens an enormous amount. Actually, 28,000 there, thank you. 28,700 nearly. The important point about this, though, is that I can do my coding first, and then I can ask for permission later. So if I'm interested in making a contribution, I don't have to go and ask for permissions on the repository. I don't have to go and ask permissions to become a contributor. I can fork the code base, go off and do my work, and lead with examples. So code first, permission later. And I think this is certainly a barrier or breaks down a barrier when trying to advocate for a change. You can actually go and make that change before having to. You don't have to advocate for the option to make the contribution. You can go and do the work and lead by example. So this is actually the longest. I wanted to prove that GitHub eats its own dog food and uses GitHub to build GitHub. So this is GitHub, the code base internally. And this is, I think, our longest ever running pull request, our most commented pull request. And it was by somebody who wanted to change the About page. This is a screen grab of that page. And you can see, there's the initial code contributions at the top. This is a design change and functionality change. You can see images coming in, a whole bunch of people commenting, a whole bunch of code. These are code additions here, comments, new images, more code, more code. And then when you get to the bottom of the page, you can see the PJ Hyatt merged commit in to master at the end. So that merge to master was actually the change going live in production. And so pull requests, merging pull requests is kind of the core kind of part of how people collaborate on GitHub. But I think one of the things that's interesting to me when you have projects that are open, like what does the collaboration look like? What is the actual, this difference between open source and open collaborations? Like, what is the expectation of a contributor or a potential contributor to their changes going back into the library that they're interested in? So this is a project called Redis. So this is a key value store in memory store. It's a bit like Memcache. It's a very popular kind of caching layer for web applications. And this is time across the bottom here. We've got about 3 years worth of data. And on the y-axis, we've got the fraction of pull requests that get merged over for a given month. So the size of the dot here is actually how many pull requests were open that month. And what we're looking at here is, in this month, there were only a couple of pull requests, but they were all merged in. But over time, this project is, well, I'm an astronomer, so I see a trend there, but we can argue about that if you don't. But you can see that basically this project is getting more popular. These dots are getting bigger, but actually the fraction of pull requests that are opened, like the fraction that's getting merged in, is getting smaller. Compare that with something like Ember, which is a pretty popular JavaScript web framework. This is wildly popular project. This is now only actually about 2 years worth of data, in fact, a little bit less than that. This is a project that's growing in popularity. This is a more open collaboration than Redis, right? Redis, they're both MIT licensed open source projects, but one is actually taking a large number of community contributions. So I think there's a difference here, and I think this is important And this is actually a library in astrophysics, a very popular project called AstroPi. And again, you can see the project's really getting a lot more popular. There's about 2 years worth of data here, but they're pretty good at. They've got a bad month at the end, but we'll ignore that. I'll rerun the data. But yeah, they're pretty good at taking contributions. But sometimes things like this happen, right? So this is Homebrew. It's written by a British guy who thinks that the word formulae is cool, and Americans get upset with that because Americans like formulas. And occasionally, you see 63 files change. This is somebody saying, actually, it should be formulas, and apparently about once a month, I know one of the maintainers of Homebrew, about once a month somebody opens a pull request. It takes them a ton of work. And actually, they probably just do a find and replace. But they send a pull request in, and they say, I want to rename formulae, and that never goes well for them because most of the maintainers are British, and they don't care. So there's a governance thing here when you have 4,000 people contributing to code. But at the same time, these things, somehow these open collaborations manage to create something of great net worth to the community. There's a really, really wonderful blog post that if you're interested in kind of open source and academia by a guy called Fernando Perez. So he's one of the lead engineers on the IPython notebook, if you're familiar with that. He's at Berkeley. And he has this kind of pretty well argued thing that the academic environments today are where papers are the kind of culmination or the only thing that gets credited in academia. These are, there's no actual real incentive to share your research products other than your papers because there's no credit baked in as a researcher. He kind of has this idea that open source projects, the ones that are distributed, people working in different languages, they're reproducible by necessity. There's no way that you can collaborate with 100 other people if you can't quickly evaluate somebody else's work and understand the contribution that they've made and whether it's a good contribution or a bad contribution. The way that these communities exist is more reproducible and one that the academics could learn from. People who collaborate well on GitHub are better at collaborating because they have to be. Because if they weren't, they're often not in the same room. They probably don't know each other. They might not speak the same language, but they have to find a way of working together because otherwise their project just wouldn't grow. So, what's the thing that open source brings to academia? Well, I think, does open have to mean public? I think this is a really important question. I think Alex and I have been bouncing around today. What does it mean? Is this kind of way of working a sort of a call to action for an open science kind of way of working? Do we have to share everything we're doing as we go? And I don't think it does. I think it's actually, open can be kind of different stages there's different stages of openness. There's open within your team, within your department, or within your institution, or maybe with the whole world. But the kind of principles are the same, that what you're doing should be electronic. This is not meat-based communication, but something that's electronic and that's available to everybody. Preferably, and I think this is something where Git does actually give you something, the branching we were just talking about in the meeting before, the idea that people can go off in different directions, make a feature branch work, and then the technology is actually helping you with the merging back in later. But the process as you're working is exposed. And I think that's a really important principle that's immediately transferable to academics. Again, multiple people working on the same thing. This is a lock-free environment. But overall, we're talking about some kind of low friction collaboration that open source has that academics typically don't. But this isn't completely true. There is some interesting stuff happening in academia today. And I wanted to take a chance to just kind of talk through some good examples, I think, of open source collaborations on GitHub. So this is from the sort of very small. This is a guy called Dan Foreman-Mackey. He is a astrophysics PhD student at NYU, and he's written this really nice sampling library that is up on GitHub. It's a Python framework, but his initial release was for his own. I think he was doing some exoplanet research, but his initial release was about a year or so ago now. But he's basically had a reasonable number. We're looking at probably 100 now, I think, pull requests, but people doing really useful things. So stuff that was not on some published roadmap, but that's of value to other folks. So this is a guy in guys who basically initially there was a pull request to make the library work well in an MPI environment, and now somebody's actually optimizing the task allocation in that environment. So this is a library and a piece of software that's growing in terms of its function and use for the wider community, all through pull requests from people that Dan doesn't immediately know. This is something at a sort of lab scale, I guess. This is Titus Brown at Michigan State University. So this is a library that does, I think this is a genomic, this is a DNA analysis routine. I think it's looking for, I think it came as whatever. I don't know what that term is. I think it's some kind of inconsistency in the DNA structure. But this is a piece of software that is, this is the lab publishing this. This is a research group, probably 10 or 15 people working on it. And then you've got like full scale. I don't think it's any accident that this is a division of the NIH. This is a whole institute, the Cancer NCIP, publishing all of their software, a curated list. They've got, where's the number? They've got a couple of, 160 public repositories up on GitHub. Everything they do is public, and these are the kind of core software that they want people to use. This is a kind of a curated set. So that's software, but there's really interesting stuff happening in the collaborative authoring environment too. So I started with that maths textbook, but this is a rather wonderful example of the SciPy conference proceedings. So if you want to present at SciPy, then you actually this is the master branch, but I think there's a 2012, 2013, 2014 branch. If you want to submit a paper to SciPy, you fork the repository and you make a pull request with your paper in. And the review happens in the pull request. And acceptance to SciPy is a merge back into the branch on the SciPy organization. So I think that's pretty neat. And then there's a bunch of stuff happening in teaching, actually. So I think it's, the IPython notebooks are, I think, a really significant advancement in this space. This is a scientific Python lecture series. I think worth noting that starring on GitHub is a bit like bookmarking. Somebody, 250 people have bookmarked this, but 59 folks. You got a question? Sorry.
Sort of a higher level question. As you get to more complex environments, or like your last example, turning in a paper. When I was an undergraduate, to turn in your first computer science homework assignment, you had to use a special version of Emacs and say, meta-x, turn in homework.
Right.
That got rid of 200 people out of a 600-person class because they couldn't figure out how to turn in their homework. Yet, I wouldn't dare say that a large fraction of them could have been pretty good computer scientists.
Right.
That was MIT. But it was sort of an unfair way to weed people out, and without the pieces that translate GitHub into normal person speak.
Sure. Yeah.
Like, let's say, an astronomer who's not a programmer.
Absolutely.
That was...
Yeah, so I think training is a huge factor in adoption. So there's actually a really good training program called Software Carpentry, you might have heard of, which is run by the Mozilla Science Lab these days, which sort of takes on this challenge, right? Like you're a new undergraduate or postgraduate and somebody says Python and you're like, what? You mean, what is that? And you're going to be using it and go and like both learn how to structure code and think about documenting code, but also like one of the core components of that is versioning and GitHub, in fact, actually, because there's this.
On the other hand, you can argue like if you're going to be a scientist and you're not like journals, taking journals like Catherine when she was doing her molecular biology, always journal and you stack them up, and you always had that, and versioning your data is just good practice, right? I mean, there's the number of scientists who basically probably lost data, who can't show it. I mean, so 20 years from now, I think people will just be, you have to. So there will be pain now, but if these people are going to be scientists, shouldn't they be learning how to store away their data? They can't just write in a journal anymore. It's not.
I agree with you in general, though. It's in 20 years. If you were a professor now, in 20 years, you will, and if you needed to turn in a paper, you know the GitHub method, but the new thing that's out there, you'd be like, what the hell? Student, can you just submit the paper for me? And not try to deal with it. Like, I'm sure my advisor could program in Algol 68 really, really well, but it doesn't kind of
Get paid a lot to do that still, can't you?
You know, but part of education, Simon Peyton-Jones said this in one of his TEDx talks, is like, is teaching people the skills they need for the jobs that don't exist yet, right? Are in the sense that pushing to, I mean, there are pushing sort of the state of the art, so that people are being trained for the next generation, not. It's so, aren't we ready for this as a community?
Sure.
But it's related to yours, which made me think of it, and that is both in the submitting a paper to a conference and the turning in homework assignment.
Mm-hmm.
There's a subtle aspect of that workflow that I'm not familiar with how it would work on GitHub, which is the submission is not visible to everyone else.
Sure.
Right, so my homework shouldn't be readable by all my classmates, and the paper might not, if for every conference, be visible to all the other submitters until it's been merged.
Sure.
So how, is it just a workflow assumption that it's okay for it all to be visible in those contexts?
So in teaching, so the way that people use it is it's a private repository typically,
that's what I was
and so the student will fork the teacher's, the professor's repository, and then submit a pull request, which is private, because the repository is private. And
And you can have Travis run on an auto score.
you joke, they do.
I'm
They're
serious,
doing
that's what I
auto
would do.
scoring, right? So when they get the pull request, they've got some stat for how they've scored it, which is
Least amount of effort for the teacher possible.
yeah, but also awesome. Yeah, yeah, but I mean, for this, no, I mean, for the SciPy, I mean, that's perfectly fair. But I think there are communities now. I mean, the Kamer library I just showed before. Every time Titus Brown submits a grant proposal, he publishes it on submission. He's like, I don't know if I'm going to get this money, but here's what I just asked for $1 million for from the NSF. Yeah, there are people who are just okay with that. I'm not arguing that's ready. Not sure everyone's ready for that, but some people are doing it. Yeah. So these Python lectures are, both look like this when they're in their executable form, or in their rendered form, I should say. But this is a kind of a growing space for us. But I feel like I have to explain this stupid title, so I'll come back to that. So that was the setup, I guess. So I'm going to do some variable substitution. And there's a telescope called the LSST, which some of you might have heard of. This is the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope. And this is the, I guess, evolution of the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, which some of you will be familiar with. SCSS was something that Jim Gray had a lot of influence over with Alex Saleh at Johns Hopkins University. So LSST is the next kind of generation all sky survey telescope. I should show you a picture of it. It's incredibly badass looking. This is about an 8-meter mirror. Here there's a version with a EU-sized rendered person in it. Would be about this big here. I didn't realize it wasn't. Yeah, there's an official EU side probably. There's regulations for everything in Europe. But this thing is going to scan the visible sky, the sky it can see every 3 nights. So the Sloan Robotic Survey, would image. I think took a decade to image about a quarter of the sky at depth. This thing's going to image all it can see every 3 nights. It's basically going to do video astronomy. And it's going to have 2 core data products. It's going to have a continual stream, they call it level 1 data, of things that look a bit like this. So when you're imaging the sky every night, then sometimes things are going to have changed. Like you're going to look at the sky and say, there's a new thing there. It wasn't there last night. It wasn't there the night before, but it's there now. And that might be a low-flying rock, like me. It might be an asteroid, or it might be a new supernova, or it might be a gamma-ray burst. It might be, they call these things transients, so things that are changing in the sky. So it's going to it's going to be this data stream, 10 to the something, that could be 5 or 8. The number you get is kind of depends on who you talk to. There's going to be probably hundreds of millions of events coming off the data pipeline every night live streaming, and it's going to ship with a small postage size stamp image of the sky with a crosshair saying that thing, and here's some basic information about it. And then it's up to the community to go and point their telescopes at it. And then there's going to be the level 2 data. So this is like the data release, a yearly cadence, big data releases, all the imaging that's done over that year with a reduced data product, a lot more effort going into the data set. This is a telescope that's inherently open because of the way it's being funded. It's a jointly funded project between Department of Energy and the NSF, and it's kind of expensive. It's like $500 million or something. So it's inherently open because of its data policy. It's got an open data mandate. Any of us in the US can get all of the data if we want it, if we can take a copy of it. If you're outside the US, I think there's they're trying to encourage research institutes to kind of buy a license to access the data. It's something like $20,000 per year per institution. So it's certainly within the US, it's inherently a kind of open data project. And actually, moreover, there's actually a really cool opportunity. When you're spending $500 million building a telescope, people like the NSF and DES want you to think quite carefully about what type of instrument you're going to build, which is fair. And so they set up all these working groups who were interested in different science cases. So you've got people who are interested in supernovae and galaxies and the large-scale structure of the universe, dark energy, AGN. And so each of these groups have been spending about the last 7 or 8 years sitting down regularly 3 or 4 times a year saying, well, what kind of science do we want to do? And what kind of instrument would we need to build to have our science serve best? And so, there's lots of science that's possible with LSST. But these groups have basically informed the design of the instrument. So they've been working together for close to a decade. So they've helped design the telescope, and I think there's an opportunity for groups like this to do more. And so the question is, where do communities form? And certainly with LSST, it's around a shared challenge. They're interested in doing the same science. You can get a bunch of people in a room together to talk about the problem they're interested in solving. So LSST has both their interest in the shared challenge, and there's also this kind of flies to the honeypot, or whatever the phrase is. There's this core shared data product they're all going to have to use. They're all going to start with the same data product. And so I think there's an opportunity. There's these hundreds and hundreds of researchers who have shaped the design, but they actually have an opportunity to do more than that. They're all going to do basically the same science, or very similar science. They all have their own interests, but they've got an opportunity with LSST, I think, to do something interesting. And I think for me, this kind of argument applies to any large centralized science project, that they should basically just copy open source. They should copy what open source communities do in terms of how they build the core parts of their software. And here's why. I think in open source, there's this kind of ubiquitous culture of reuse. It is people spend time reading other people's code, copying each other's code, having an opinion on implementations, maybe making their own implementation, but people are using each other's work. And I think the best example I have of my recent experience with this is a friend of mine who is also an astronomer, is currently riding a bike across America. So that's quite impressive. I think he's following the route of somebody who did this in 1884 on a penny farthing, which is even more impressive. And he's somewhere in Nevada right now. Actually, I think he's in Nebraska now. But Stuart, this guy Stuart Lowe, he's carrying with him not something dissimilar looking to this. He's got a non-smartphone, and he's got quite a nice GPS that gives him latitude and longitude. And we had a conversation when he was in San Francisco. He said, I'm getting on this bike, and I really want to have a map that shows where I am. I want to update a map. And so, I said, well, have you got a smartphone? And he said, no, I haven't got a smartphone. I was like, oh, well, what have you got? Well, I've got an old Nokia phone and a Garmin GPS. I was like, all right, well, I'm sure we can do something like this. And he'd already actually, to be fair, he had, this is a file format called GeoJSON, so it's geospatially aware JSON structure that we render quite nicely on GitHub if you upload it. So he'd already worked out his path, and he said, it'd be really cool to update a map. So I was like, we must be able to do this. So went to Ruby Gems. I typically write Ruby if I'm trying to get something done. Searched for SMS. And something like 50 lines of Ruby later, the story here is not that I'm a good software developer, the story is that this was not hard. 50 lines of Ruby later, we've got a little service where when he's done at the end of the evening, he sends a text message with his latitude and longitude, and it updates the map, right? So it's just a deliberately small example, but this software that, that to be able to achieve that, you've got many components in what you build, like many components in your software stack, but the point for me about that story is that my kind of 50 lines of code were about the thing that's different, like the value add, the thing, the particular thing I want to achieve. I have no idea how to receive a text message as a web service, but somebody else had built me that library already. I had a particular use case. My use case was I have a GitHub repository with a map in it, and I have somebody who wants to send messages, and I want to put those two together. That was the thing I was trying to build. And I think this should be the same with research as well.
So we touched on this when we were talking one-on-one, but I think the issue with science, especially astronomy, is big data.
Sure.
Right? And so like Jim Gray, who worked on this for years, was fond of saying, that SneakerNet still was, doing better than internet at delivering astronomy data for really big data. So I mean, fundamentally, sharing the source code is fine.
Yeah.
But really, when you're collecting all this data, a lot of what the scientists want to do is share the data so they can run their different experiments.
Sure.
Maybe different so same data, different programs.
Yep.
Of course, sharing the programs is great, but fundamentally they need to share the data.
Yep.
So how do you sort of see Git, interacting with the whole big data movement, which every science is generating tons and tons more data. It's easier, whether you're a biologist or astronomer, it's easier to store it.
Yeah, so I mean, Git does not help you in any way with data. I mean, Git's not an appropriate technology for that, but I think
How would you integrate? I mean, how would you, because a program, when you execute, is the source code plus some inputs.
Sure.
And so, having, I understand that's outside of GitHub, but to make this really work for science seems like you need a story around the data.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of people working on solutions that do this, and so I would say there's a collection of implementations that have varying likelihoods of successes, I would say, in my opinion. And research workflows that are executable, that try and combine compute with data with some kind of versioning of and provenance capture of the software that you're executing. The kind of current breed do something pretty smart, I think, where they insist on referenceable and accessible data stores. So you've got where are you? I'm in my compute environment. Okay, well here's some abstraction of what it looks like to run a workflow. But where do those resources come from? And the resources can be referenced as a binary at a URL or a Git repository. So people are basically programming solutions together, typically, where they're referencing, some of the software might be on GitHub, the data might be local, or it might be an API that they're querying. I mean, that's sort of in LSST, the data sets are projected to be, I know Moore's law and people, it's kind of not wise to argue against that, but I think I don't foresee people hosting 50 petabytes of data on their laptop in 6 years' time. I think we can work that out. That's not, so people aren't going to do this locally. So LSST, they've already kind of got a model where there's going to be a few centers where people, I think one is at NCSA, where they're going to have a large, probably virtualized compute environment where you could run your compute. So the opportunity here is not, so I agree that data and Git are only a piece of the problem.
I understand Git has always made a separation, right? There are other web services that provide build. You don't provide build as a service, for example, right? Yeah. So you've never been in the business of providing other tooling other than sort of your value add for collaboration.
Yep.
That's been the main focus.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
No, that's
and
right.
I just want to sort of pile onto that because astronomy is an interesting example to take here because with the LHC and with LSST, the notion that you needed to devote a not insignificant amount of the funding of the project to figure out how you distribute the data is unique.
Yes.
It does not happen in other domains.
Right.
And Jim Gray was talking about this a long time ago, and
Yeah.
it's now, I think, getting to the point where that notion of the expectation of the funding agency that you will share the data.
Yep.
They haven't solved how you pay for it and
Yep.
where it goes and how that's sustained.
Yep.
But that is sort of coming to fruition,
Mhm.
and it's now, I think, then leading to the okay, then what?
Yep.
What happens when we get to an environment where everybody's sharing the data? What do we do with it if there's an environment for sharing the code?
We know what they'll want, right? What they'll want eventually is to say, stop writing your software from scratch. The data exists. Here's the framework for which you develop your algorithms, and stop translating from 17 different formats and spending your grad student 5 years.
Right.
Leverage a framework,
Working on one of the
working on a system that we
pixels.
support.
Yeah.
Right, and so and this for me is the opportunity with where not everyone's producing their own data, and it's not feasible to host your own copy of the data. Or you're not going to build your own LSST. You're probably not going to have your own copy of the data. So, but the first, I don't know, if you're thinking about like a standard data reduction, 95% of the operations that you perform on those data are not actually uniquely your contribution. They're just like the legwork, some massaging of the data, some probably quite primitive analysis before you do the bit that's the actual academic contribution. And so this is where I think research has an opportunity to learn from open source. Like the software that you are writing as an academic should not be the whole kind of pipeline. It should be somebody, like the data reduction pipeline should be there, and your value add should be, and your academic contribution should be the 5% on the top. But that's not where we are today. So if that's something where we want to get to, like how do we even make that, not many people are doing it today. What are the significant barriers to actually making that behavior both possible and in fact normal? So I think the first one is credit. Like as an academic today, I write, you would write a paper and you would get credit, and the mechanisms for rewarding that, i.e. tenure, a professorship, are understood. But this Ed Lewowska is just down the road in UW. This is he was at a launch. I was going to say party, but I don't think it was a party. It was an event there's a co-funded program between the Moore and the Sloan Foundations to build kind of where I guess the assertion is that kind of data science is the bridge between lots of both computationally and data-rich domains, where methods are kind of key and to the domain, and the fact that there's lots of the environment we exist in today in universities, kind of the culture that we have, is that people who build tools, people who write software, don't actually get academic or equitable credit for that kind of behavior. And so when you're looking at something like this, this tool that's come out of the Titus Brown's lab, then they go to enormous lengths to point out that you should be citing them for this work. They've both, it's in capitals because that's. I guess they're shouting at us, but there's a file called citation, which basically says, like, this is a piece of research software. This is its DOI. This is how you can reference it. You should cite this. This is scientific software. If we go back to that AstroPy project I was showing the contribution graph from before, this has had 75 contributors. This is a project that's being built by fairly early career postdocs. They've got something like, they're a pretty healthy GitHub project. They've got nearly 200 forks, a couple of hundred stars. They actually wrote I think a paper about this project. If you look, there's a badge. I think this is the Python Package Index. Will give you like this flare badge. It's had 32,000 downloads in the last month. This piece of software. It's basically used by pretty much all astronomers worldwide. And yet the paper about this project has had, where are we looking? 28 citations. Right, so there's something going wrong here, right? But this is the only really established way to collect career points right now, is to write a paper about the code. But there's David Donoho kind of nailed this when he said that publishing a paper is just about code is just advertising. The actual scholarship in scientific software is really often actually in the source code, not in the PDF that you choose to share. So, these are significant numbers. These are significant measures of reuse, forking, starring, number of people watching something. But right now, we don't have there's there are people who are pushing on this. It's called altmetrics, but there isn't an established, recognized by tenure committee way of valuing, giving a value metric to these kind of open contributions that we see here. So I encourage you to look at some of the altmetric stuff if you're interested. So this feels very appropriate to be putting this slide up here. But I think, as research becomes more data intensive, as we're moving into this domain of methods, and the tools that we build are becoming more and more key to actually doing any research, then there's a great talk by a lady called Victoria Stodden, who's at Stanford, she talks about this crisis in reproducibility, how we are becoming, as more and more of our scholarly activities are encoded in software, and this actually isn't published typically, then we are becoming less and less reproducible as a domain. This is my XKCD summary of her talk. As we get more data intensive, we become less reproducible. I think I've never shown her this. Hopefully she wouldn't be too offended. It's an excellent talk. So what are barriers? So credit's a big barrier. I think trust is a barrier. I think people are both scared of sharing, but also like, how do I trust somebody's software? I mean, when I went and downloaded that Ruby library to do SMS parsing, it's called Twilio Ruby. Like, something about this number made me think it was probably okay. 600,000 downloads. I mean, I don't assume that everyone's. I think that's got some value, that number. But deeper than that, I can actually go and look at the code. Obviously, if I really care, I can go and read the source code, and I can go and get a code climate measure. I can see that they've at least written some tests, or hopefully they have. I can go and see those tests executing. I can gain confidence with that, and I can actually go and see what code climate says about churn and quality of what they're writing. So there's tools and ways and means that we can do that, and I think there's
third party.
Yeah, so these are all third party integrations here.
Parties, okay.
Yes.
So can you just say a little more about the code, the next one?
So the code climate.
Yeah.
So this is
what they're offering.
Oh, they look at.
So they do build, tests.
They don't do CI. So this is Travis CI. Mm-hmm. So all of these.
Yeah, Travis, I know. Yeah.
Travis. So Travis does the CI. Code climate does like method length kind of duplication. I think it does. I mean, I forget what the. I think it looks at churn as well.
I see.
But it tries to give you a score. So this is nearly green. It's pretty good. I think 4 is.
Okay, so more static code complexity.
Yeah. So these are all things that can give me confidence. But there's also a serious problem with academic software, and more generally in more kind of niche domains where you're lucky if you're working in a kind of a widely adopted field where there's a standard way of publishing. If you write a Ruby gem, which is kind of the de facto way of packaging up some functionality in a library, you put it on Ruby gems. This is where you find these things. I mean, most people who have got are shipping Ruby gems are publishing them here. So there's a kind of a de facto place to go and get them. But discoverability is hard, I think, in academic domains. And so knowing that somebody's even written software similar to you is a serious problem. But in truth, I think most of the barriers that we have are cultural and not technical. They are about like how academia works, not that there aren't tools to service the needs of academia. So for academic audiences, I kind of encourage them to think about what they can do today. And I think there's a kind of wisdom, again, coming from some people now that we should just stop talking about kind of open science and just start doing it and see where it breaks and where it works and where it doesn't work. And so when people are sharing, I kind of encourage them to think about why. Are they sharing because they want credit? Are they sharing because they're trying to create an open source community? They're trying to get collaboration happening online? I think this is a really important question. But I think the general message for research communities, we want to try sharing a bit more often. But if you are doing that, then certainly put a damn license on it, because that matters. So we give a lot of prominence to this on GitHub, and also that documentation matters, because the sharing story I want to tell in the future is not this. Is that there's like this step first, which is some Git clone of the latest version of that bad pixel mess, because that's the kind of thing that's still lasting with me a decade after writing that thing. So when it comes to telescopes like LSST, I think the open data argument is the absolute least we can do. There's so much more in terms of opportunity. And this is not about open science. This is actually about accelerating how science happens. So that is me. Thanks.
Going back to the NIH
Yep.
example with the CA star, CA big, CA core, CA whatever.
Yep.
Do you have any metrics on how reused the various components in the framework were? I remember folks working on that
Right.
10 years ago.
Right.
But I believe the culture has shifted significantly in 10 years.
So in terms of actual reuse or mandating sharing?
People's willingness to share from the bottom up as opposed to in compliance with a mandate.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding, 3 years ago I was writing grants to the NSF, and there was this data management plan that you had to write, right? And you still do. And I put it in a drawer. Yeah,
And wait for someone to have an implementation of something to manage data to use.
Right, and yet I think my understanding is that only in the last 6 months has anybody not got a grant because of what they wrote in their data management plan. I mean, you could I'm going to write a shit ton of software, pardon my French, and then I'm going to burn it all at the end. Like I'm not going to share it with anyone, and that was okay. You just had to say what you were going to do. So that's NSF, and I still believe that you can say this is going to be a closed source project, like because we want to write a ton of papers and we're in competition with. I mean, I think that would be, people would be like, really? Is that like, are you really going to do that? But it would certainly be better to say this will be open source and open data. I think that's, yeah, or some kind of embargo with some. NIH, my understanding is quite a long way ahead of that in that there's, I mean, it's still, I think it's still more of a mandate than. I was at an NIH event a few weeks ago, and Phil Bourne, who's the new director of data science, is there to affect cultural change, right? And his joke is, well, what do I do in my second week? But I think that's a serious challenge, like to actually. So yeah, I don't know. That's a very long-winded way of saying I don't know what. But I know there's definitely in the US, there's a difference at the agency level as to whether they're just asking for you to say what you're going to do or saying you have to adhere to this policy or...
There's increasingly with the OSTP memo from
a
year ago.
I mean, the White House said you had to, right?
And there's legislation in committee this week to put that into more effect. The expectation is still turning now to you will make your data available unless, and then there's...
Unless you've got some,
human subjects data, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
What is unclear is how the agencies comply with that when it's effectively an unfunded mandate. What do they need to put
make
in
me
place?
share, but you have to...
Who's funding this? How's it being sustained?
Yeah. Which is an opportunity, right? For, people with cloud platforms, that kind of thing.
Can you talk briefly, getting back to what you were talking about with getting credit for code, talk briefly about the project that you did with Mozilla and Figshare and how that's going right now.
Yeah, so we, actually I was going to show you something, but I don't think that's a very good idea because I don't know what I would show you. I was going to go to a web browser. So right now, there's a growing movement to make more things they're called research objects, so things in a researcher's portfolio that you might want to cite. So, the idea being that you might want to cite a data set, or you might want to cite a piece of software, or maybe even just a figure from somebody else's work or something. And so there's some services, one called Figshare, there's Dryad, there's Zenodo, there's a bunch of organizations that are taking on the burden of, I guess, hosting data and giving some kind of guarantee of its preservation. And then issuing these things called DOIs, so Document Object Identifiers. And these are basically they're a bit like a kind of a bit.ly URL, but not HTTP. They're a referenceable string that you can cite and use these DOIs to reference something that's maybe it's a paper, maybe it's a piece of code. So just over the last couple of months, been working a little bit with the Mozilla Science Lab and Figshare and Zenodo, who are a couple of these archivers, and we basically made it really easy to get a DOI for a GitHub repository. So it both archives the repository, just gluing together a couple of APIs. So there's actually not been much code written on the GitHub side, but more just making sure that those groups were kind of walked through kind of how to integrate. And yeah, so there's, I think somebody was saying about 2,000 pieces of software have had a DOI issued for them now across the two services, which is pretty neat. And
What, about a month?
yeah, and I hear that they're credible pieces of research software that you would actually really want to, cite. I mean, right now, a good example for me would be in cosmology. If you want to, there's a piece of software called Gadget, which is used for simulating, making your own universe in your computer. This thing is on some guy's website. You download a tarball and he says, please cite me like this and use this URL. But it's, if he leaves that university and that web space goes away, a whole bunch of people are just not going to be able to, if that was where there's a preservation and longevity and issue with lots of research software. So yeah, apparently, the things that people are getting archiving and getting DOIs for are really significant contributions. So this is cool. There's a broader problem that some journals don't let you reference the software, which sucks. It has to go in the appendix. So it's not, but that's we can beat the journals up about that. Many journals do now.
Questions? All right, well, thank you very
Cool.
much.
Thanks for hosting me.
Thank you.